Daneza, Sekuza, Skyza, Chiefs, Hereditary Chiefs, guests. First of all, I want to acknowledge the territory that I'm on in Clately, Tene, in north central British Columbia. I just want to thank Islam Unravelled and the greater Muslim community for this invitation for speaking in this momentous day, recognized by the United Nations to end racism and discrimination. I just wanted to acknowledge all the speakers today and know that here today that all of us that are here are allies in this fight against racism. It has been quite a difficult year. It's been a year since we've been in this pandemic, and I'm very fortunate to receive the vaccine, and it would be how easy it would be if we can only have a vaccine to end racism and end the discrimination against all Indigenous peoples and racialized peoples here in Canada and around the world. But we certainly know it hasn't been that easy. And as we experience this pandemic over this last year, we've certainly know the shortcomings of society here in British Columbia and in Canada, where we've seen really the discrepancy of treatment of Indigenous peoples within the healthcare system. We've seen really the racist attitudes towards Indigenous peoples in the treatment of the vaccine and the rollout. And I think it's really indicative of this society that cannot reconcile with itself in terms of acknowledging the true peoples of this land. And as we move forward, I certainly know that there are solutions and ways forward to really transect this issue, the barriers that divide us. And as many of you have stated here today, that racism is a learned behavior. And as we move forward, it is part of the solution, where we're very fortunate in this province, and I want to acknowledge the work of all the MLAs, including Michael Lee and my brother, Adam Olson, who was also in the legislature that momentous period in November 2019 when we passed the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, Bill 41 here in this province. One of the first governments in Western society to do this. And really it provides all Indigenous peoples in this province to turn the page, to reconcile what has been a very difficult relationship with the colonial system. And since colonization began, our Indigenous peoples have suffered for far too long. And in many respects, as we move forward, colonization really equaled genocide. The genocide of our Indigenous peoples, whether it was by war, by biology with viruses, or by policy with the issues of taking us off our lands with the reservation system and the Indian Act, or taking our children away, as we've seen in the last 100 years with the residential school system, the 60s scoop, or currently what we've seen with more recently within the child welfare system, the birth alerts with the taking of our children out of the parents' hands. And certainly this has a lot of detrimental effects on Indigenous peoples. And as we move forward, I certainly hope that part of that solution is the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, where this country can really reconcile with itself in terms of realizing that the Indigenous peoples have detrimental adverse effects that has gone on for far too long. And we've seen it in the last year as well in the report from Mary-Ellen Trapelafon, In Plain Sight, the healthcare system, and all the reports that we've seen from many Indigenous peoples within the healthcare system in British Columbia. And certainly this has happened across this country, as we've seen the videos and social media of Joyce Saskatchewan in Quebec. We've seen the reports of the last year and the issues with the policing system. More recently, the death of Talokiat Man in the last month. Myself, relatives here in Prince George, British Columbia, Everett Patrick, Chantel Moore in New Brunswick, Rodney Levi in the Atlantic coast, where we've seen death in custody of our Indigenous peoples. So if racism is within the general public, we certainly know systemic racism is occurring within institutions, including government and the acts of the forms of government that we've seen that is really has detrimental effects against Indigenous peoples, as such as the Police Act. What I'm seeing now is that there is a real movement towards changing this narrative, and whether it's with the alignment of laws here in British Columbia to align with the Declaration Act, as we've seen with the child welfare system or the environmental assessment process, or perhaps within forestry. We right now today are working on ways forward where the alignment of laws can see this change happen for Indigenous peoples. And certainly, moreover, in this country, as we've seen the proposed legislation for C-15, which is the Declaration Act as a federal act. The floor for that act and what it was born out of was Bill 262, the Romeo Saganish Act that failed a few years ago. So as we move forward, we certainly hope that there is a way forward, and the United Nations Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples declaration is that perhaps one of those tools that we can utilize. And it's not the only tool. And I really believe that within the education system, where many of the issues that we are dealing with racism can be unlearned, and the ability for our people, our racialized people in this country, can really tell that story and develop curriculum that is about us. And far too often, as we've seen over the last 100, 150 years, that the history that is being told in Canada is very limited in terms of the true history of our Indigenous peoples. I myself am Carrier, Sekani, and Gikson, and we all have our different oral histories. And that should be part of the educational school system. And as we move forward, we also know and acknowledge that the policing system needs to change. As part of the Assembly of First Nations, I do hold the portfolio along with Jocelyn Picard from the Regional Chief from Quebec in justice and policing. In the last few weeks, we did have a policing forum and looking at our Indigenous peoples to be more inclusive and having an ability to really set policies and regulations within policing in this country. I'm glad to see that this government here in British Columbia, the NDP, are revamping the Police Act, that there will be an anti-discrimination and anti-racism act that will be coming forward in the near future here in this province. And I think, we're at the very beginning and at the start of a new relationship, perhaps. And as we were last year during this pandemic, we saw all our brothers and sisters, all our Black brothers and sisters rise up with the Black Lives Matter movement. And as we witnessed the horrific videos of many of our Black brothers and sisters being killed in the United States by the police, it was very similar to our people here, our Indigenous peoples here in this province, in this country. And as I said, we've seen many reports, such as Mary Ellen Tupelo-Lafon's report in the healthcare system, We have reports on policing, such as the Frank Paul inquiry, in Saskatchewan, the Stonechild inquiry, and many other reports from across this country that have recommendations on how best to move forward. I believe that the time for reports is over. We know what to do. We know how to make the change. And this has to come from the inside of government, the federal and provincial government. And really, this is the challenge that where we're at right now as Indigenous peoples. In this job as a regional chief, as well as our other two provincial territorial organizations, the Union of BC Indian Chiefs and the First Nations Summit, are really trying to be the agent of change within the legislature and within Parliament to make sure that our allies and that the people that are in power are changing the laws within government. And it has been a challenge so far. It's been well over a year since the action plan was began. We're still trying to complete that action plan. We're waiting. That needs to happen now. And as we move and to pass Bill C-15, the federal act, the next step, the real difficult piece to really enacting the declaration as law is to make the change within government and make the change within law and policy within the federal and provincial system. That's our challenge, and that's really the difficult point where we're at today. We're also at that difficult point as well, as we've seen from this federal government, the promises for an action plan on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls national inquiry, the well over 260 calls to justice. And we're still waiting. That needs to come, and that can't happen soon enough. And it has to happen now for the justice of our people and our women and our girls. And moreover, what we certainly know is that what the declaration really is, it isn't a special giving more rights to Indigenous peoples. Rather, it's just a recognition of our Indigenous rights and as human rights. And really, the declaration is trying to gain equality. All we're asking for as Indigenous peoples through these acts is an equal footing. And that's it. And really, that's what the point of the United Nations Declaration is within the United Nations, was to give the Indigenous peoples around the world an equal footing. And in many respects, the United Nations Declaration is fighting racism. And what is racism? Really, to me, and if we really think about it, and if we really break it down to its core and to its basics, it's the discrimination of Indigenous peoples because of who they are, or perhaps who they're religiously affiliated with, or because of their sexual orientation. The discrimination is the imbalance of power. And really, that's what racism is the power that is imposed on the Indigenous peoples, on those that don't have a voice, is to keep that power over them. And that's what we're fighting here. And to all the people here today, I really thank you for this moment in time, and recognize that all of us that are here today are fighting for something. We're fighting for equality. All our brothers and sisters, all those racialized here, were in many respects cut from the same cloth in what we're fighting for. And it is for our human dignity, our human rights. And I'm really glad that when I agreed to speak to this forum today, is that knowing that we're all allies in this room, and that we have more allies out there than you know, and including the general public that know and acknowledge that this is what we're fighting for, is justice for our people and equality. And I just want to thank you. Thank you for this time today, and then Masicho. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Regional Chief Terry Teegee, for your time and sharing those words with us. Again, as newcomers to this land, even though many of us are racialized minorities, even though many of us are religious minorities, at the end of the day, the rights holders, the first people here, are the ones to which, we offer the strongest bonds of brotherhood, with the strongest friendship and the strongest allyship. The Muslim community stands with you, and Islam Unraveled in particular. We have to stand with you and to fight against the ignorance, the injustice, and the racism. The pre-colonial history of the First Nations people, your language, your culture, your faith, your background. We need to teach this. We need to share it, especially with us as newcomers on this land. When we pray in our houses of worship, it is on stolen land. There's many thoughts in our school of thought that makes the prayers invalid, like to be on land that was stolen. And I will say that many people, they just don't know. They don't understand what's the continuing injustice that's going on, and that it's not just something in history books. Thank you so much for speaking here today. We appreciate it, and we'll continue to stand with you. If there's anything else that you'd like to say, Regional Chief, please go ahead. Or
I just want to thank you once again. Is that one of the things that has really been resonating with me today with all the speakers is that we're all cut from the same cloth, and in many of the stories that I heard, sadly, I've experienced that too. Different people in the school system, and that story of our Indigenous people is being followed because we're brown in the stores. That it just perpetuates in society, and that can't be allowed anymore. And I think once we get to that place, and I think we've definitely gone to that place, we've passed that place, is that we need to do something about this together. And the way we do it is that we get a groundswell of people and make sure that our governments, our members of legislative assembly, our MPs, our people in government, including myself, to be accountable and responsible to make sure that we follow through with what we promised in terms of making change and develop a plan ahead in terms of how best to create a space that is accepting of all peoples and what we know as this country is of what we know as Canada. And it can be that place. Right now it isn't for any Indigenous person, it isn't for any racialized person. But that dream of Canada being this place that is accepting and a great place to be and multicultural, we can't lose that, and we must shoot for that for all of us and for the betterment of all people and all people in Canada. I want to thank you.